Well, I mean, for me personally, I really just want an answer. I I'm still at the stage where we don't know why she went to New Hampshire. We don't know really anything. We don't know a whole lot more than we knew the night that we got the call that she was missing. And so I would like just one answer, and that would fuel me to continue on to get the next answer. Okay. And then maybe we'll find her, and then, then we could get justice. And so that's kind of the motivating factor for me. But I do talk about hope a lot, and that's something that is not talked about enough, and how that's all that family members of long-term missing and murdered cases have. That's what motivates us. It fuels us, but it also torments us because, there's some days where you just resign yourself to the fact that you may never know. And you have to come to terms with that. And you have to allow yourself to be okay with that. You might never know, but you're still going to you're still going to try. You're not going to give up. And sometimes you can see family members just move on and lose that hope. And it's heartbreaking to see and hear. And so something I tell family members is no matter what, you cannot lose hope.
That's Julie Murray, a victims advocate, the current host of the Media Pressure podcast, and the sister of Maura Murray, a 21-year-old woman who went missing in 2004 in New Hampshire. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Julie Murray is the host of a new podcast called Media Pressure, where she not only tells the story of her sister Maura's disappearance from the perspective of her family, Julie also has become an advocate for victims and their families and one of the leading voices calling for empathy in the true crime space. On February 9th, 2004, Julie's sister Maura, a student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, left her campus dorm room and began driving in her black Saturn sedan. At some point, she headed north. Sometime after 7 p.m., a resident in Woodsville, New Hampshire, heard a loud sound outside her house. Through a window, she saw a car on the opposite side of the road. A passing motorist who lived nearby stopped at the scene and said he offered a young woman, who was presumably Maura, help, but that she declined. The motorist called the police, he said, because he knew that there was no cell phone service in the area. The police say that by the time they had arrived, the woman had disappeared. The police report said the car's windshield was cracked, the airbags had deployed, the car was locked, and directions to Burlington, Vermont were found inside. The case was treated as a missing persons case and eventually was deemed suspicious. The investigation has turned up few tangible clues. Maura had vanished without a trace. Maura's disappearance began a years-long journey for her family as they sought to find her, wrestled with law enforcement, and attempted to advocate for her in the true crime and media spaces. Maura's disappearance was described on Oxygen Television Network as, quote, the first crime mystery of the social media age. Along the way, the family also struggled with misinterpretations of their actions, Maura's life, and what happened that day, and encountered those who sought to take advantage of what to them was one of the biggest true crime cases, but to the family was their lost sister, daughter, and loved one. It became a space where speculation was taken as fact, and the victim and her loved ones took a back seat to the true crime mystery. These and other reasons are why Julie started an Engage with Empathy campaign to unite survivors of crime and the true crime industry supporters and content creators to help with the difficult journey of those struggling with loss and to make it a little more bearable. On the official website run by the family, you can find a quote from Samantha Power, the human rights advocate who wrote the seminal book, A Problem from Hell, about genocide. Power says, quote, all advocacy at its core is an exercise in empathy. The campaign recognizes that both the internet, social media, and true crime can be dark and dangerous spaces for people who are vulnerable, and the cost to loved ones in the background can be enormously high. It's easy to look at Julie's situation as sui generis, but many people have loved ones taken from them out of the blue, and all of us go through suffering. Today, we're going to discuss how you grieve when you do not know what happened to your loved one or get a chance to say goodbye. We're going to talk about the victim's needs from law enforcement, the public, and the media, some of the challenges that families face in this new media landscape, and a better way for law enforcement, courts, the media, and the public to help support loved ones as they try to mourn, heal, find peace, and search for answers. And we're also going to be talking about things that we can all do to manage our losses, which are universal. Hey, Joy. I just wanted to take a minute to thank you for joining today and just give you an idea of sort of why I originally reached out. I had, recently I've been thinking a lot about sort of not just the true crime space, but the criminal justice space and media coverage of it. And one of the things I had been thinking about recently is, the criminal justice system is really struggling with how to handle the media, the coverage, YouTubers, podcasters, other people like that. And I've sort of felt that between things like judges issuing gag orders and families being just overwhelmed by the process, the media saturation, and in some cases harassment, one of the things that I had noticed is that less and less am I hearing the voices of victims' families. And so I had been thinking about that. And then somehow, I don't know whether it was TikTok or Instagram or whoever it was, fed me a video of you giving a conversation about victims advocacy. And then at some point after that, there your name popped up again. And then I heard you give an interview on a podcast right after that. And I thought, okay, this is the universe telling me that I need to talk to Julie Murray. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for reaching out. I really appreciate it. And you're right. The victims and the secondary victims, the families, are usually just steamrolled in these stories and these cases and pushed to the side. And we're missing a big piece to each of the stories, not only my sister's, but all the other unsolved missing and murdered that are out there, by just kind of blanketly stating that, well, the family is too subjective, too emotionally involved to be able to speak on their loved ones' cases. But who better to speak on these cases and these stories than the people most affected? And that's the family members.
Yeah. And I think it feels to me like the just thing to do to sort of raise the voices of victims' families. But I was talking to an investigator not too long ago, or a retired investigator, was saying to me that police officers and investigators will often make this mistake of not spending enough time with the families because, and the point she was making is how the victim lived their life and the truth about them, as opposed to all the rumors you hear, are one of the sort of cornerstones to being able to solve a case. And I was recently having a conversation with a defense attorney who was like, oh, but defendants' rights need to go first. And I pointed out to him, you do realize the 17th word in the Constitution is justice. And I just think sometimes I don't know what it is about the system or even the coverage that we pay. It feels like to me, this is just the feeling I get, that if I were to line up a ton of people, they would all say to me that the victims' families and the victims themselves are very important. But then when I watch the behaviors, I see something very different. Is, is that something you experience?
Yes, absolutely. I've experienced that. I've had 20 years of experience in dealing with that, and a lot of times what you see is these stories and the victims boil down to the few decisions that they made before tragedy struck. And the same can be said about my sister's case. What's missing in all of that is the more holistic view of the actual human being before the tragedy struck and who they really were as a human being and how they navigated the world. And we're missing a lot by just boiling down a story to a couple decisions that the victims made before um, they went missing or murdered or whatever the case may be. And that certainly has rung true in my sister's case. And that's one of the motivating factors for why I became more public, because I was seeing all of this discourse online speaking about my sister, and it's from through the lens of strangers who never met her. And I wanted to give the alternative perspective of someone who grew up with her, who shares her DNA, who knew her best, to kind of give some of her humanity back. Because what happens is when you have so much coverage, especially in a big case like my sister's case, you lose who the person actually was, and the person becomes more of a character in a screenplay than a human being.
It's interesting you say that, because I've always, even in, the work I did as a journalist, one of the things that I sort of hated was the worst case scenario is we have a distorted picture of the victim. And I feel like that happens often, but often not often, but at times those people will get called out. But almost at the best, we have a flattened picture if we're not talking to the people who knew them. And when you were describing that point about only paying attention to the last moments or days of someone's life, it just feels like it flattens them, and you don't really see what they loved or what they were like or what mattered to them. You just see those last moments, and they become this almost flattened distortion. What was your sister like?
Well, my sister was much more than just a young 21-year-old college kid who made some poor decisions. She was extremely talented, both athletically and academically. She was a phenom on the track. She made nationals. She broke every record in the high school. She um, just loved to compete. And that was also true in the classroom. She graduated fourth in her class. She got astronomical SAT scores, almost perfect on the math portion of the SATs, which I'm very jealous of because I was not
Me too.
fortunate enough to get that gene. So, um, just a really talented individual. But when I describe Maura, I like to let people know that she would be the last person to tell you any of that. And she was humble and she was kind and she was unassuming and she wanted to leave places better than she came upon them. And she just had her whole future ahead of her and she wanted to be a nurse. And my mother was a nurse and she wanted to help people. And just a outstanding human being with flaws, as we all have. And throughout the coverage of the last 20 years, people only focus on the flaws and the poor decisions. And I would argue that if you put a microscope on any of us at 21 years old, we would also have
Or
a litany.
41 or 51. Right?
Exactly. We would have a litany of poor decisions on our resume. And so she's typically boiled down to those few poor decisions that she made. And she was much more than that. And if she was funny, she was witty, she was, um, you know, just somebody that you wanted to be around. And
Yeah.
yeah.
It sounds like from, what I have read, and that's limited, it sounded like she was very altruistic, very open-minded. Um, and, you can see those nuggets in some places of where people are talking about how much she cared about people. But is that what you think drove her? Those kinds of things sort of drove her and propelled her forward? Because we all have our crosses that we bear. All of us are bearing crosses, and something has to push us through it.
Right. Yeah. I think she deeply internalized a lot. And again, when you're 21 years old, your view of the world is very limited. And so things that we would consider as adults as not that big of a deal, a fight with a boyfriend or a bad grade, are magnified because of your limited scope of the world at that age.
Yeah.
And it turns into a much bigger deal because you're so limited in your experiences. And I think that is part of the reason what drove her to make that poor decision to get in her car and drive to New Hampshire on a Monday night in the middle of February and not tell anyone.
Right. Well, and it makes sense. I think about it with kids and I think about it with young adults that until you've been through something, and sometimes until you've been through it several times, you don't always know that you're going to survive or be okay. And I just think that it's an important thing to think about because I hate to put it this way, but I think that in a lot of cases, where someone goes missing or is murdered, I think that there's a lot of judgment of the person. And I don't necessarily mean that entirely in a negative sense, but people go to asking themselves, what did this person do or what did they do? And I think we don't think enough about the fact that we've probably all done things just like that. Like, if I disappeared this afternoon, people are going to wonder why, I don't know, I didn't take a shower and I decided to drive this way instead of driving that way, but they didn't realize I saw a goose in that direction that I wanted to follow or whatever it is. And, I think there's probably a lack of starting with empathizing with people when it comes to things like this and imagining ourselves in people's shoes or even imagining what they're like. That's one thing I really do like about your podcast and your sister is I felt like I was getting more of a 4-dimensional or even 5-dimensional human being.
Yeah, and I tried to. That's the point that I wanted to get across. The message that I wanted listeners to walk away with was we're talking about a multidimensional human being. And I wanted to bring in people, not only myself, but other family members to give different perspectives and friends and people that she crossed paths with to paint that holistic view of who she was as a human. And based on the feedback that I've gotten from the podcast, that is what people are walking away with, and they're no longer thinking of her as this character, as this just storyline or plot device, and they're seeing her as a human being, and that has probably been the most rewarding part of telling her story in my own words in the first place.
Yeah. Well, because it's sort of like, in a way, one of the things that I thought when I was listening, I think I was a couple episodes in, I was like, wow, Julie's really singing sort of her sister's song. She's telling her story. and that stuck in my head because I know for me, last October, my mom passed away, and I was crying a couple weeks later, and someone said, "Don't cry." And I said, "No, that's okay, because my tears are this is just me singing my song for my mom." And I sort of felt like you were doing that to some extent in, in your podcast. So,
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. And yeah, that is, I'm glad that you got that message, because that's exactly what I was trying to do.
yeah. Okay. One of the things that I was, I really think that we don't do enough. We talk a lot about, like you said, when somebody disappears, or the time before, and we don't really talk about their their life. And I know you've done some of that, but I also feel like in this particular case, it seems like your family has also gotten flattened collectively. And I was wondering if there's anything you want to share about Maura and your family that you would want people to know.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Everyone in my family has become a character in the story, and our humanity is also stripped away, and our decisions are also put under the microscope and dissected. And what people don't realize is that when tragedy strikes like this, families don't know what to do. That you're not given a guidebook. Do this, don't do this. Here's how you interact with media. Here's the things that you should be doing. Don't trust these people. And so we're just winging it. And of course, we made mistakes. Every family in this position makes mistakes. But since her case is so high profile, every single decision, every single word that we said, even early on and even now, 20 years later, is up for public debate. And people want to find hidden meaning to
Mm.
the things that we're doing and saying, when in reality, we're just trying to get by. We're trying to find Mara. And we don't always say the right thing. We don't always do the right thing. And it's hard to balance, because on the one hand, we need social media and the awareness, because that's how cold cases are solved. So we have to put ourselves out there, and by doing so, we become targets for internet debate. And it's just part of the process. And my family has certainly experienced the negative side of being public and advocating for answers and resolution. And it's not an easy road to go down. And there are other families who opt not to be public because of that very reason. And it's unfortunate, because there's victims out there that people have that don't know about. They don't know the case. They don't know the name. They don't know the photo, because there is a level of privacy that these families just feel like they need, because it's a constant grieving process. The grieving process isn't like traditional loss, where you go through the different stages, you know what happened, you are able to have a memorial or a burial and move on with your grief process. Our grief process is cyclical. So it bounces from stage to stage, and we have no control over when each stage is going to hit us. I mean, I could be coming home from work on a Tuesday and a song comes on that reminds me of Mara, and I just lose it. And that's what people don't see. You're not going to see that in the coverage on the internet.
Right, right. I had sat down with Bruce Maitland earlier this year, and one of the things, his daughter Brianna went missing. What was it? Maybe about a month after Maura, and he was talking about how important it is to respect that different people within even the same family need to be able to process things their own way and go through their mourning process, which we already know when someone dies, it's never ending. But he was making the point that the uncertainty of missing a person being missing makes it so much harder. And as he was talking about that idea of like the importance of respecting that, I was sort of thinking to myself, what happens in a family where no one feels like that they can speak up and stand out? Because I even think of a case like Maura's case, which is very well known, but at the same time, it may be very well known within the true crime community. It may be very well known among, certain law enforcement. But to your point that you do need social media, I'm willing to bet there are a ton of people who don't know necessarily about the case or what they might have seen or heard or could be helpful. And I just wonder about those families where nobody feels strong enough to to sort of raise their voice and bring awareness.
Yeah, it's scary. It's scary to put yourself out there. It's scary to become a target. It's scary to get online and receive hateful comments and people casting aspersions on you, the family member, who are just trying to raise awareness for your loved one. And not all families and not all family members are in the right emotional headspace to do that. I can say from my own experience, it took me years to be in the right headspace to be able to put myself out there publicly and sort of be this public facing figure for my family. uh, that was sort of forced into it because my aunt Helena passed away, and she was the public facing spokesperson for my family and the conduit between the media and law enforcement. And yeah, there are so many families out there that just aren't able to do it, don't have the resources, don't have the emotional capacity to do it. And that's okay. And that doesn't mean that they'll never be in a right headspace to do it. But I think forcing families to speak on these deeply, deeply personal stories is one of the problems with true crime. It's almost as if the public feels like the cases are public property and the
Mm,
families owe the public all these deep personal stories. And we don't. We're private citizens and tragedy happened to us. We're not obligated to share anything, really.
that's an interesting thing because it's that idea that things sort of flip once a case begins to get attention, and it becomes, I guess, instead of, I mean, you use the word obligation, but people feel like there's a certain role you have to play and that things that you have to share and questions you have to answer. And another thing that sort of stuck out about what you said, I was just thinking about like that idea that time is constantly in motion and where we emotionally are moves. And it sounds like it was an evolution for you to get to the point where you could talk to you. Do you ever feel days now where you feel like you're not equipped? Do you give yourself the grace to 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 have that? Bruce said something really interesting, and this was before we actually got on the interview. He said, "There's a part of a part of Brianna that's just for me." Like, do you keep that sort of that part of Maura that's just for you, or do you give yourself breaks when you need breaks? Like, how do you handle those things?
Yeah, it's a tough balance because when you're in a position like mine and Bruce's, you feel like if you turn down an interview or you turn down a podcast, you're doing a disservice to your loved one when in reality you're maintaining your focus, you're maintaining your mental health to be able to be in this for the long run. Because Brianna and Mara have been missing for decades, and you've got to pick your battles, and you can't say yes to everything because you'll burn out. And then who's fighting for Mara? Who's fighting for Brianna? So it's definitely a balance. I've learned to set stronger boundaries for my own mental health, because when I first became the public facing figure for my family, I wouldn't turn down anything because I felt like I owed it to Mara, and I needed to speak to anyone that was willing to cover the story. And I learned that that's sometimes detrimental to the overall mission, which is, okay, how is this furthering the case? Am I going to be able to sustain this pace? And there are some times where, especially after vigils or big news breaks, where I just feel, I call it the media hangover.
Mm.
It's definitely a real thing, and you do all of these interviews and you're pouring your heart and soul, and it's so emotional, and you get through it, and then the next day you just feel like you were hit by a Mack truck. And that's happened to me many times, and so I've learned to scale it back a little bit and be more selective on what I choose to do with my time.
Is there advice if, there was someone who was listening right now who is in a similar situation, where they've lost a loved one? Is there advice you would give them, things that you wish you had known at the beginning that would have really helped you to know?
The first thing I would say is you need to get a support system around you whom you trust. Because there are some people in this space that are in it for reasons that are not always altruistic. And I've found myself in many situations where I accept help, and it turns into a quid pro quo situation where the person turns on me and says, "Well, I helped you with this. Now you owe me this." And
Wow.
that's not exactly how it should work. But then you feel that sense of obligation again to make good on showing your appreciation, and making sure that that person feels valued and appreciated. But that is a tough situation to be in, because that's not the point, right? The point is someone offers help, and you think they have the victim and the family's best interest in mind, when in reality they don't. They want something from you, or they want something out of it. So I've learned to distinguish between those people who are in it for the right reasons, and that just takes time and experience. So you need to surround yourself with people you trust, people that can act as a sounding board, because a lot of times there's things that I need to get off my chest. I need a sounding board, but I don't necessarily need to do it on Twitter. I don't need to put all my thoughts online and then receive feedback from strangers. Sometimes I just need to talk about what I'm feeling and just have someone listen. And if you can't trust people, sometimes you'll think that they're acting as a sounding board and a confidant, and then you do check Twitter and your comments are now posted online.
Mm. Are
So
are there like little warning signs for you? I was thinking as you were talking about like that whole idea of like giving a gift, and part of the reason why I love giving anonymous gifts is because it's truly a gift. Like, even when I give a gift, I don't expect anything back from someone for it, or don't want anything. But I know sometimes people can be so sensitive on their own that they almost feel like they have to give you something back. So I love anonymous gifts. But I feel like there are a lot of things in life, in thinking about like your story, and many others where it comes and it looks like it's wrapped as a gift, but it really has, there's like a price attached to it. Are there any sort of tip offs or clues for people?
Yeah, well, I think the best way to weed some of that out is to take the time to establish rapport. So, if you're speaking with somebody or you're coordinating some sort of search effort or awareness effort, if the person isn't willing to listen, isn't willing to do multiple calls, isn't willing to respond in a way that you feel that you can share some private stuff, some stuff that shouldn't be made public, that's going to come out over time. So if you're interacting with a person and they want the information immediately, but you're not in the right headspace to talk about it, that's a red flag. That's something that I've learned the hard way. But that's a key indicator. And then, of course, are they in it? Are they in it for the long haul? So, do you interact with a person, provide information or an interview or some sort of exchange, and then you never hear from them again? That's another indicator that they're really not in it the for the right reasons.
Yeah. I was thinking about something you had said before about there's no guidebook or there's no roadmap that anyone gives a family that goes through something like that. But I was also thinking that even if there were, just thinking of the most stressful days of my life, like 2 or 3 of the most stressful days of my life, that even if you had a guidebook or a roadmap, you probably wouldn't even know how to use it at that point. Like, because I think people have a hard time understanding that logic and everything else that you think you would do, it just flies out the window. What was it like for you guys when you first found out? What did it feel like for you guys?
Oh, it was just panic, absolute panic, chaos, dread, all the emotions. And then, it's hard to fathom the day after I found out Mara was missing that she wouldn't show up. And then that's compounded day after day after day, months turn into years, years turn into decades. And so you sort of callous yourself over to withstand some of the emotional roller coaster rides that you're going to embark on when
So
you
you're
do.
almost like bracing yourself for the
Yeah.
pain, right? Like here it
Yeah.
comes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So you definitely learn how to do that. And I can't really put into words what it felt like. People ask me all the time, when you got the call, where were you? Who called you? What were you doing? I have no idea. I have no idea. That's all blurred. All I remember is the feeling. And the feeling was dread. We knew something was terribly wrong. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to navigate it. We didn't have any experience with media. We didn't have experience with law enforcement. So we just sort of went blind. We just trusted that, okay, the authorities know what they're doing, this is their job. They're going to do the right thing. And come to find out, years later, we found out that there was definitely some areas within my sister's case that were not even um, basic protocols, 101 investigative protocols weren't followed, but we had no idea. We just blindly trusted that things were being done. And so there was missed opportunity after missed opportunity. And if I could have that time back, I would have had a notepad and written down every single word that was said. And
Mm,
I you just don't know what you're going to do in that situation.
yeah. And I guess that's also probably an argument for families of victims like your sister, like your family, and and to be able to have even access or avenues to other people who have gone through similar situations. Were there any families that reached out to you guys in the early years or days?
We were lucky because we had multiple families that reached out and offered assistance and help. So we had the Molly Bish family. Molly Bish or was murdered a few years before Mara, and that was in Massachusetts. So we had the Massachusetts bond there, and they helped out and provided resources and um, sort of just an ear and a shoulder for my family during those early years, as well as the Maitland family. I remember the Maitland family and my family got together. Bruce actually met my dad and helped search an area. And it's this weird thing where two fathers of missing women come together and you don't need to say any words. There's just this shared grief that's palpable. And that certainly was the case with Bruce and my dad. And we're forever grateful for just them being there and being a support system for my family. Um, and still to this day, I mean, I'm close with Molly Bish's sister Heather, and she's doing amazing things, as well as I keep in contact with Bruce as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it sounds comforting to have that kind of support going through. And I may be completely wrong about this, but I would imagine for a lot of us, not everyone, because we're also different, that losing someone like you lost your sister and having someone so important to you just no longer be there, to just sort of vanish. I would imagine that if I were in that position, it might, and this may be my own bias because of my own personality, make it harder for me to sort of develop deep attachments with people. And then to compound that with sort of grifters, manipulators, people who may be well-intentioned, but they're really just in it for a quick moment. Has this entire experience impacted the way that you approach relationships in general? Because I wonder if it would make me more skeptical or more reluctant even to connect with people out of the fear of loss. Because, yeah.
Yeah. Trust is a casualty when you experience something like this. It is hard for me to trust anybody. And that permeates into not only my involvement in the investigation, but over into my personal life. And it has many negative effects. And that's something that, I've been in therapy for and something that I'm working on, something that I'm aware of, which is the first step of understanding what's going on. Um, there's also this weird phenomenon that happens. I thought it was just me, but I have a problem making future plans. And say I have an event to go to and I know the date that it's going to be on, the date's not going to change. Something in me doesn't allow myself to book the flight. And it's nonsensical. I know I'm going, but I'll wait till the last minute to book the flight. And I couldn't really figure out what was happening. And so I actually talked to other families of missing people, and come to find out, they also share that same trepidation of future planning because our worlds are so ambiguous and we don't know, and we don't want to take the future for granted. And what if something happens? And I know it doesn't make sense and it's illogical, but it is something that I've noticed in talking to other families of missing people that happens. Not everybody, of course, but there's been a few. And then there's this whole morbidity view of the world. And,
Right.
You're driving down the street, going to dinner, and you're looking over and you see somewhere where you could potentially hide a body. And
Right.
you don't speak it out loud because, you're trying to be a functioning human in society. But I certainly think it. And with some of my close friends, I'll say it just because I want to get it off my chest. But you do have this weird sense of um, morbid thoughts that come through your mind.
Oh yeah, no, it makes sense to me. I've when I was a reporter, I definitely felt that, particularly as a crime reporter, you're seeing every imaginable way that a person could die, everything from them being shot in an alley to a brick falling off the side of a school and hitting a schoolgirl in the head. So you don't look at buildings the same way, right? I'm like
Right.
looking up for the loose bricks. And I had a guest who's now a friend. She lost her cousin to murder, and she told me the story of just like walking down the street one day in her town, which is in the Pacific Northwest, and seeing a girl who looked a little bit like not a one for one match, but a little bit like her cousin, who was distracted, had her earphones in, and she just wanted to run up to the girl and say, "Pay attention, anything could happen to you." But also the thing about not hitting the last button on plans does sort of make sense to me, because there's one aspect of it that's like, I'm always going to be waiting for the call to find out something or some big event that could potentially happen in the case. But there's another piece about like when you lose somebody who had all these plans for their life, had all these things, and you had all those plans at the same time, and then it all shatters right at once. You feel like you don't have really control over things in the same way. And I mean, it sort of makes sense to me why the future would be a hard thing to pull the trigger on if future got taken away out of nowhere like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit on another point that I didn't mention about the internet. And most people know this about me, but I love to hike. So did Mara. And we love being in nature, out in the mountains, camping. That's what we did growing up. And before I go on a hike, or if I'm on a hike and I don't have signal, I freak out for a minute because I'm thinking, well, what if the investigator calls me? I need to be able to get this call. And it ruins the hike. And the people that are with me think I'm crazy. But it is a real thing. And even camping, I camp out in the mountains of Virginia, and there's a campground that I love that you have to drive about 5 minutes to the lodge to get signal. And I'll find myself doing that, 8 o'clock at night after I've been at the campsite all day or hiking, just to check, just to make sure, okay, there's no calls. The investigator isn't lining up a big search tomorrow, or there's not a break in the case. So it's sort of like I'm tethered to my phone,
Mhm.
and it's not a great way to live life. And it's not what I'm used to, because I want to be able to just shut my laptop, turn the phone off, and go on a vacation, but I can't.
Yeah.
And that's another aspect that people just, unless they're in my position, they just don't understand that. Because how many times has it actually happened? But that's not the point. It's the potential for it to happen. And in a 2-decade-old case, there's always that potential that, okay, at some point, someday, I'm going to get that call. And if I'm in the mountains and I miss it, how horrible would that be? And so it's definitely a struggle to find the balance to make sure that I'm doing what I need to do to be healthy and happy, and also keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on in the case.
Yeah. No, I mean, and in a way, it makes complete sense to me, because it's that same, oh, that anxiety about being disconnected. And then, it exists for all of us. Like, there's inevitably somebody who's going to be listening to this conversation, and they're going to think of, like, I don't know, whatever, their new girlfriend or their new boyfriend, and waiting for their text and not wanting to be out of signal. But then you add to that, it's one of the most important people in your life, and it's about honoring them, right?
Right.
And I think, and this is, you probably see my brain, the way my mind works. Like, it's about being able to allowing people to speak, and then being able to find empathy and connection with them, if that makes sense. Um, and I think so much of what you're saying is so relatable to people if they can connect it to something in their life. But I think the most important piece goes back to, I think, what we were originally talking about is if you don't give people like you the opportunity to just even be heard about how you feel, how it feels, how things impact you, um, it's really difficult. And it takes me back to like the days of being a journalist and thinking about all the things that we would find out about, let's say, a perpetrator or a victim or some ancillary person or witness. And in this sort of modern age of media, I've found that all of those things get dumped out immediately. Where, if you go back 20 years or you go back 25 years, we would stop and pause and say, like, does this really add anything to the story? I know it's like really salacious and it sounds X, Y, or Z, but this is going to do um, harm without really adding much value uh, to the story. And I feel like we've sort of lost that. And it's very interesting. Someone was asking me what makes a journalist. I was like, oh, what makes a journalist is you collect information and you share information. That's constitutionally. But one of the core parts when you look at the ethics, the voluntary code of ethics for a journalist is you minimize harm. Right. And I feel like there's no incentive for people to pause and ask, like, is this adding any value? Is it
Yeah.
creating any harm? And what's the balance? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've definitely experienced that. And this idea that you need to be first, the race to be first. And what happens is that causes so much harm to the families who aren't given any sort of warning or heads up, and they just see a headline, breaking news, whether it's actually breaking news or not doesn't matter. You still get that visceral reaction when you're seeing a story about your loved one or yourself online, and you have no warning, and so you stop everything, and you need to consume it and figure out, what does this mean? What steps do I need to take, if any? And most of the time, you don't need to take any steps because it's just totally um, has nothing to do, and it's old information. But it does give that sense of panic and that pit in your stomach and all the anxiousness that comes with it, because you never know. And that's something that I have worked with my investigators and law enforcement, where they understand that it's important before a major search or some sort of development in a case that the family at least gets a heads up, a quick call, an email. This is coming. But you don't always see that with the media. Sometimes with traditional media, but in today's day and age where you've got YouTubers and freelance and independent journalists out there, they're not always going to give the family the heads up on a breaking story that probably isn't breaking. And it takes hours and hours um, away from the family just to kind of process that type of information.
Yeah.
And then, do you respond? Is it something that needs a response, or do you just ignore it? Do you just sit with it? And so there's this whole process that goes with it.
Yeah, and yeah, to even just sort out what's happening, I think one of the things that the impact of like the false leads or things being made bigger than they really are can be huge for the families. That thing you said about like picking up the phone to give a heads up, I can definitely remember some times where we picked up the phone to say to a victim's family, hey, we're doing this 3-part series. You may not want to read the third part. Like, we made the decision that some of this stuff is going in, but here's why, or whatever it is. And I think a lot of creators today don't even know that they can pick up the phone and reach out. But to me, it's just like, make the effort. It's not that hard. But it brings me to a question. I saw that video that I had mentioned before about you talking about that concept or that idea of engaging with empathy. And it really stuck out to me that in so many of these conversations that we have about crime or the criminal justice system, whether it's the defense attorneys or the prosecutors or law enforcement, us in the media, judges, you can pick, we don't spend a lot of time, getting to know people, figuring out what would be empathetic and what, or even just how certain things would feel for you all. And I'm just wondering, I think sometimes people think that if I become close to or I find out the needs of certain people, all of a sudden that's going to change the way that I cover something or I handle something or I investigate something. But the reality is, I think it just leaves you informed so you can take that into consideration. So I'm wondering, what can we do to engage with that kind of empathy and take into consideration um, the feelings of families like yours?
Well, I think one of the key things here, and I've certainly been blamed for this. I don't think I deserve it, but this idea that families want to censor the information, I want to control the information. That's simply not true. If there's information about my sister that is relevant to the case and is fact based, then sure, I want that out there. I don't want to censor facts. But if it's salacious, if it's not based in fact, if it's just hearsay, it has nothing to do with furthering the case, then that needs to be considered before it's posted. Um, that's not always the case because, again, the rush to be first and people want to get the story out, even if it's not fully vetted yet. So, this idea that family members are trying to censor information or control the narrative, listen, I want to find my sister. That's what I want. And if more information surfaces, I want it out because that could mean that it could reach someone, it could jog their memory, it could further the investigation. But the majority of the information that comes out, especially in my sister's case, from independent type folks are not based in fact and just rumors. And that's hurtful both to the investigation and to the family members. So, giving a heads up or saying, "Hey, I found out this new information. Do you know anything about it?" That goes a long way. And I'm I don't have any authority to tell anyone, "Hey, don't do that." But I could certainly add context. I could add nuance. I could make a correction, or I could say, here's someone that you could talk to within the cold case unit that could maybe provide some additional detail. Or here's a private investigator that might know something that you don't, so that you can really develop whatever information that you think you have into something that's more fact based. So the key thing is centering the victim with this type of breaking news. And then, of course, avoiding speculation. And that means you're going to have to do some due diligence. You're going to have to do some research, and that's not sexy, right? That takes
Right.
time, and that takes time and effort. And you may think you're missing your window to be first to get the story out, when in fact that's what you should be doing. You should be fact checking before you just plaster something online that could be hurtful to everyone involved.
It's interesting you said that when you said the phrase centering the victim. I think if I had heard that before this conversation, I would have instantly had that image of like, putting a halo over the hat of the victim and kind of like making them perfect. But when you said it, I really thought something different, like almost like, centering the victim is really about solving their case, about sort of caring for, the values, protecting their families, all these different things, right? But the most important part, of course, is bringing them justice. It sounds like that,
Right.
centering them really, because you made those points. It's not just like that idea of not saying something that would be negative about the victim or that might be hurtful for the family, but being careful about those things, but but still doing it if it will help solve the case.
Right. And my sister's case is a prime example for this. There's a ton of unflattering information about my family and about my sister. And some of that furthers the case. Some of that gives us better insight into her mental state when she made the decision to go north in her car that was running on 3 cylinders. I'm all for that. This isn't about making the victim seem perfect, because I will be the first to tell you that my sister wasn't perfect. My family's not perfect. I'm not perfect. I make a ton of mistakes. But
And none of us are. We should also
yeah.
add that part.
And then you've got to, as a journalist, you've got to balance, is this in the public interest, or does this piece of information have any relevance to furthering the case? Does it have anything to even do with the victim? And what is the harm in publicizing it? And so that's the balance that I wish would have been considered in some of the early and some of the recent coverage on my sister's case.
Yeah. The in terms of, your sister's case on some levels is different, probably to some extent, when it happened, the story, her age, all sorts of things probably played a role in it. I wanted to ask you, do you think, I imagine it's different for you all because you have the media spotlight, but then in some way your suffering is like every other person who loses someone to being missing. Like the truly deep part of it is probably universal for people.
Yeah, I mean, in all of these stories, you've got this family ecosystem, and a key member is torn away, and the family ecosystem is different from that point forward, and you have to figure out a way to continue to support each other and um, move on without this integral part of your life. And um, it's not easy, and the media certainly um, doesn't always necessarily grasp onto that concept. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny too, because I think, you're probably onto something about the everybody wanting to be first, but I think some of the things that you're talking about doing, like reaching out, and even if you can't connect with family members, try to put yourself in their shoes if you can't reach them. It costs you very little, actually. It really costs you very little. Maybe you'll be, I don't know, 30 seconds later or an hour later on the tweet, but rarely do I hear people talking about like Joe tweeted that faster than Jim. Like it's not exactly what we're thinking about. But or um it doesn't cost you anything to be nice. It doesn't cost you anything to be silent. You know what I mean? It
Right.
doesn't. But you can create big costs for people. So I have a kind of running theory that in watching the sort of content ecosystem. And, I sort of feel like, particularly in the last, I don't know, 5 to 6 years, there is more and more content, Substack, YouTube, Twitter, Pick, all sorts of different things. And it's very varied. And some of it comes from the perspective of people who consider themselves advocates, journalists, experts, attorneys or other people doing analytical work. They're very, very different in their backgrounds. And there was a day and age where the vast majority of people covering cases like this would have been traditional media, and there were systems that law enforcement had in place, that courts had in place to sort of manage the process, ensure things like, holdback evidence didn't get out, or that, juries weren't tainted. And now it sort of seems like law enforcement doesn't know what to do, how to either take advantage or stop the wave of this stuff. Judges are increasingly using gag orders to keep people, including family members. I think of like the Delphi murders of Abby Williams and Libby Germain, where their family, you know, has to ask for permission to go to a conference to speak. And and I just think, are there you know, so what essentially happens, right? Like in your case with Maura, you guys are the expert on her life. You guys were the only ones who were paying attention to her whole life before it became public. But all of a sudden, this whole ecosystem, or in the Delphi case, the families or other people, everyone who really knows the victim has every incentive to not engage or gets crowded out. Is there a better way, do you think, that the criminal justice system and the media can handle these kinds of things?
Well, you bring up an interesting point. So when we talk traditional media, we're talking about outlets that have resources. So a legal team to have dissenting opinions, an editorial team, a producer. So you've got all of these resources. But when you look at independent creators, you've got a single person who acts as the producer, the editor, the fact checker, the graphic designer, and there's not a whole lot of room for competing narratives or discussions about what the information actually means. And I don't really know what the answer to that is, other than for people to infuse their content with empathy, like we talked about, and consider the harm that posting something or putting out a story may have on both the case and the families. Um, but I've definitely seen the difference between those two. Not to say that all traditional
Mm-hmm.
media uses all of the resources that they have at their disposal, but there is something to be said for these these lower or not super high profile cases. And even though I consider my sister's case pretty high profile, in the grand scheme of things, it's really not. So what
Mm-hmm.
happens is you have a singular loud voice, and that voice becomes the expert on everything Mara Murray. And in fact, that's not the best approach, because most of the time that person who becomes the loudest voice doesn't know all the facts or doesn't know the person themselves. And so then they become known as the case expert, and people take whatever they say as fact when sometimes it's not.
Yeah. And I mean, I think a great example that's playing out like that is the Long Island serial killer case, where there is an attorney for one of the victims' families, um, or was an attorney for one of the victims' family, who has become the voice for all the other victims' families sort of without their consent. And one of the interesting things that I was reminding a friend recently of is, like, loudest voice does not correlate to most effective. Just because somebody,
Right.
and sometimes when they're the loudest voice, that's the tip off, because that's the way they cover up not being effective. Not to say that that is actually what's happening in the Long Island case, but I was just making that caution. Like, loud and sounding like an expert can sometimes, it can actually mean the opposite of what you're I guess what you're thinking of and what you're expecting. So on some levels, I guess what we're also asking people, whether you're in the media or your judges or your law enforcement, is to just use some compassion and critical thinking, right?
Right.
Consumers too, right?
Yeah. 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 And consumers drive the industry. So if the downloads aren't coming or the clicks aren't there, these these people are not going to have the motivation to continue on in the way in which they're being sensational or salacious in their coverage of these real life tragedies. Um, and I can say from my own experience that when you do have a singular loud voice who claims to be the expert, the only defense is the victim themselves or
Mm.
the loved ones. And so in my sister's case, she's voiceless. She's missing. She can't correct the record. She can't defend herself. She can't do any of that. So that burden falls on my family. And so a lot of times I find myself spending my energy on trying to correct some of this misinformation and sensationalized coverage. And it's detracting from me spending time on the actual investigation. Because here's the deal, my sister's still missing. And if I'm battling people online and my dad says this all the time, he says, well, that's great, Joel, that all these people are arguing online, but who's looking for Mara? And that was a really poignant reminder for me to really look at how I'm spending my time.
Yeah. I was going to ask you one question, the flip side of it. So for those victims' families who feel like they're not getting attention for their cases, you made me think of it when you mentioned the downloads and clicks, because I had creators on recently as guests who do cover cases like missing and murdered Indigenous women and other things like that. And we were talking about, in our conversation, we were talking about our shared experience that when we do cover cases like that, our downloads plummet.
Mm.
We're lucky in the sense that we don't care. Because for us, we're like, someone needs to do these cases and do them well, because it's going to we'll create a good foundation for other people to do the cases. But I know for a lot of people, they do. So if I am that family of that missing, murdered Indigenous woman, or that Black kid in the middle of Southeast DC who goes missing, or whoever it is that's not getting attention, are there any thoughts or ideas that you have for those families?
Yeah, I would say you do have some control, and you do have the ability to say no. And a lot of times what happens is a loved one's case isn't covered. It's not on all the podcasts. There's no billboard. There's no flyer. There's nothing. And somebody reaches out to the family and says, "Hey, I'm interested in covering the story," and the reaction is almost automatically, "Yes, please, thank you so much," without having an introduction call and getting to the point of what is going to be covered, how is it going to be covered, what is the point, what are you basing your research on. And so that's a major problem with this spread of misinformation. If families like that are not able to distinguish between what's going to further the case and what's not, they're going to say yes, and then they're going to spend quadruple the amount of time undoing what was covered in the particular content that was created.
Kind of like you're better off with less information out there than.
Yeah. And so I've connected with many families who ask me all the time, how does Mara get so much coverage? A couple reasons. I mean, the fact of the matter is she was an attractive white woman, college age, that went missing. And there's no way around it. That's part of the reason why Mara is in the news. But the other part of that is because my family's been relentless in keeping her in the news. And we do things like write our own press releases and tee up stories for both local and national media to latch onto. So there's certain things that you can do as a family member to sort of push the information out and get the right type of coverage and get your quotes correct by doing a press release. And I've shared my template with many people, many family members, and I've shared different techniques. And, my family does a number of different things throughout the year that really are just aimed at keeping Mara's name in the public consciousness. For instance, her birthday, we do a workout. Is that newsworthy? No, that's not newsworthy. But I do a press release for it, and some people pick it up, and bam, Mara's in the news again. And people get annoyed. They say Mara Murray's case is covered so much. Well, yeah, what do you expect? I'm sitting here without my sister. I'm going to do everything in my power to keep her in the news.
Yeah. No, I mean, and her memory, right? Like that,
Right.
it's that second death that people have. The first one, you die. The line is that, and your second one is when you're forgotten. And I think it's even more complicated when a person's missing because they haven't, we don't officially know that they're alive or they're dead, but their memory can still get lost.
Right.
And yeah, and that makes it pretty. So I was talking to some friends who are creators, and one of them was like, we should create a true crime Avengers sort of. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And they were like, to hold all the other creators accountable. And I was like, actually, that's a really good idea because we don't really have anything that holds us accountable. And it almost sounds like you should join us not from the creator perspective, but from the victim family perspective, and we'll have a giant Avengers thing.
I would love it. I would dress up in the costume and everything.
Same here. Same here. Look out. So I was gonna ask you, just sort of like stepping back from it, what are, like, when you step back and you think about it and you think about your sister's case and you think about all the other victims' families, are there sort of like any hopes or dreams, like if you could imagine, a world that they sort of deserve, what would you hope and dream for people?
Huh. That's a good question. Well, I mean, for me personally, I really just want an answer. I I'm still at the stage where we don't know why she went to New Hampshire. We don't know really anything. We don't know a whole lot more than we knew the night that we got the call that she was missing. And so I would like just one answer, and that would fuel me to continue on to get the next answer. Okay. And then maybe we'll find her, and then, then we could get justice. And so that's kind of the motivating factor for me. But I do talk about hope a lot, and that's something that is not talked about enough, and how that's all that family members of long-term missing and murdered cases have. That's what motivates us. It fuels us, but it also torments us because there's some days where you just resign yourself to the fact that you may never know. And you have to come to terms with that. And you have to allow yourself to be okay with that. You might never know, but you're still going to try. You're not going to give up. And sometimes you can see family members just move on and lose that hope. And it's heartbreaking to see and hear. And so something I tell family members is no matter what, you cannot lose hope. And there's always a chance that maybe we don't find out who did it, or maybe we never find out where she is, but we might find one answer. And that's what motivates families like mine, is that hope that one day I'll get a call and I'll know one aspect of the mystery, because in my sister's case, there's multiple layers of mystery within the mystery.
Yeah.
So that's something that I wish people talked about more, is this
Yeah.
whole hope concept, and how it's very
It's
it's
complicated.
it's complicated, it's dynamic, it's
Because the thing about hope is, like, we need it to move forward. Like, we need it, you know, to get up in the morning, to go through life's trials. But at the same time, hope is a very difficult thing to carry because it's the recognition of the absence of something.
right.
And it can, I think, thinking back in my life, that if I could have learned anything when I was young about hope, is that while it's wonderful and it's important and it's what keeps you going on, it's also fragile and heavy, and be careful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, I wanted to thank you for coming on, see if you have any closing thoughts or anything extra you would want to add or for people to take away. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I'm so glad that we jumped on this call and talked about these very important topics and topics that I really enjoy talking about. A lot of times when I do interviews, people want to go through the timeline, and the timeline's been covered. The timeline on my sister's case has been covered, and people lose sight of the fact that there's a whole family in the background suffering with these really heavy topics like grief and hope and the unknowing and the ambiguity. And I think the more we talk about it, the more other families are going to feel comforted and not alone, because it's easy to feel isolated and alone in these situations. But there are so many other families that are struggling. And if you're out there and you're struggling, I just tell you to reach out to somebody else who gets it. And the connection is instantaneous. And it's done wonders for me to talk to other families of the missing and murdered. And it's given me an increased level of hope. And there are support systems and advocates out there that you can trust. And yeah, this has just been great.
Oh, good. One thing I just want to add before we stop is so much. I don't even know if you see it, but so much of what you said about hope and support and what you need in difficult times, it certainly applies to people whose family members are missing or murdered, but it applies actually to all of us, I think.
Yeah.
Right? Like those are the key things that we as humans need to keep going. So I appreciate it. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-driven Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us at Patreon at www.patreon.com/the Silver Lining Handbook. For those of you who are on Patreon, check out our bonus episode with Julie, where we explore a situation where we were both deceived by somebody we knew.